So thank you, Senator Duckworth. Thank you, Omer, for the introduction. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. So before we dig into your legislative work, as Omer had just laid out, you have such an interesting background as a pilot. I was wondering if you could first share with us really why you were so drawn to aviation and why you remain so interested in it today.
Yeah, I was not drawn to aviation at all. My dad was a signal officer, and my husband's a signal officer, and I thought I was going to become a signal officer. But when I was going through the commissioning process, I was the only female in my ROTC class, and before you get commissioned the last year, your third year, before you begin your fourth year, you're supposed to write down what jobs you want. And we sat down, and they said, okay, guys, no matter what you're studying in school, I think 5 of your top 10 or 3 of your top 5 jobs that you put have got to be combat arms, infantry, armor, artillery. And except for Duckworth, she's female, she doesn't have to go into combat. You put down whatever you want. In fact, you can't put down any combat arms branches. I said, well, that's fundamentally unfair to the men because I was going to get equal rank and equal pay, but I was going to have to face equal risk. And I thought that was fundamentally unfair. So I said, well, are there any combat arms branches that accept women? And they said 2, air defense artillery and aviation. And aviation, this was 1992, and they said probably by the next year they're going to lift the restriction on women flying combat. So I put aviation as my first choice, signal as my second, ADA as my third, and then I took the aptitude test and just for helicopter pilot and scored off the chart. So I had no idea that I had the brain that it took to be a helicopter pilot. So those of you who know that we're a little bit weird. And so that's how I ended up in aviation. And I love it to this day. My last flight in a helicopter was not the last flight I wanted, but I still fly. It took me 5 years to get my private pilot's license afterwards and get my FAA physical back. But yeah, I love it.
That's outstanding.
Yeah.
So turning to Capitol Hill a little bit, if we could talk about the FAA reauthorization. As you're well aware, many state Department of Transportations are involved in aviation, especially on the general aviation side, and we really do appreciate all your work on this legislation. So as a key leader in this debate, can you give us all a little bit of an update on where you see the status of the reauthorization process, maybe where some of the sticking points are, moving the bill forward, and if you think Congress, I guess we're asking you to handicap here, whether you think Congress will be able to finish a bill before the current authority expires on March 8th of this year.
So we have the markup on Thursday at 10. Those of you put it on your schedule.
We're making news right here, right now.
So we would not have scheduled the markup if we didn't think we could get to passage out of the committee and onto the floor of the Senate. We pretty much have a deal. There's really good stuff in this bill for everybody. We quadrupled the funding for aviation workforce development, and that's everything from air traffic controllers to pilots to maintenance people. There's a lot of good things in there. A lot of my accessibility stuff is in there as well. My EVAC Act is in there. We have 2 sticking points right now that we're negotiating over that hopefully will get done by Thursday, which is increasing the pilot age to 67 and adding more flights out of DCA.
Well, what you just said, I think, was just welcome news across this room. That's fantastic. You touched a little bit about your work on accessibility for airline passengers in there. Can you talk a little bit about a few of them, what they are, and share how your own flying experience has helped shape that?
Yeah, so I get my wheelchair broken all the time, and people say, well, it's just a wheelchair here, here's another one, a temporary wheelchair. But to me, my wheelchair is my legs. It's as if the airlines were to report that they broke 400 legs a month, and that would be okay. And so for me, it's really focused on empowering the traveling public. And it's just basic information. So requiring airlines to post how many assistive devices they break, not just wheelchairs, but walkers and canes, would then allow the passenger who's buying a plane ticket to say, okay, that airline has a 50, and there is at least one that has a 50% batting average of 500, which is not good when it comes to breaking my wheelchair. But I'm not going to buy a ticket on that airline because they've got a really terrible record for breaking wheelchairs. So it's allowing the consumer to make those decisions. Similarly, in this FAA reauthorization, we have language in there that would require reporting the size of the cargo hold of the aircraft. So that way, if somebody is a power wheelchair user, they know, okay, I'm not going to book a flight on that flight because that cargo hold's not big enough for my wheelchair, and I'm going to be separated from my wheelchair. So it's a lot of sort of deconflicting and allowing the consumer to pick and choose, and that'll make things easier for everyone.
Excellent. So, one of the priority areas this year for AASHTO is workforce, and every sector of every area is facing workforce issues. But since the pandemic, the aviation industry in particular has been struggling with a labor shortage, and you've been leading efforts in Congress to address this. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been doing on workforce issues and what you think the prospects for success in this area are?
Yeah, well, the key thing is we have a bipartisan deal to quadruple the funding for workforce development that's in this bill. But you have to understand, a pilot shortage issue is really an airline-created problem. The airlines have not hired more than an average 6,000 pilots a year. They didn't hire more than 6,000 in 1990. They didn't hire more than 6,000 a year in 2020. They didn't hire more in 2010 or 2020. And in fact, during the pandemic, they laid off tens of thousands of pilots. In fact, they incentivized them to retire, which then led to the big airlines basically having to come in and poach the younger first officers and younger pilots out of the regionals, which then left regionals without pilots. And that's self-induced. Now, you should know that in 2022, the airlines hired 13,000 new pilots, and last year, I think the number is about 10,000. So we are making that up. But part of this was really induced by the major carriers who, again, bought out tens of thousands of pilots and left themselves with a gaping hole in terms of experience. So now we have a workforce that is very young, and we have to make sure that as people get into the cockpit of the aircraft, that they are sufficiently trained to perform those duties. And that was one of the holdups. So we have a deal on the 1,500-hour rule. We protected the 1,500-hour rule, but still, we need to incentivize the pipeline of new pilots, but also new mechanics, new air traffic controllers, new advanced aviation, autonomous aviation technicians. All of that is in this bill.
So just to follow up on one of the things you just said, this reauthorization, as it pertains to air traffic controllers, because there's been a shortage in that area as well, is there things in this authorization that are going to work to address that issue?
Yes, so there are a couple things. In addition to quadrupling the funding to training air traffic controllers, we make it easier for people to go from the pipeline from military to civilian service, not just with air traffic controllers, but with pilots, with mechanics and maintenance as well. And then we also create a pipeline for more women to enter as well.
Okay. So you already sort of addressed the next question a little bit when you were talking about some of the young workforce and maintaining some of the standards. But so you've been leading on this debate, but we know we need to bring new pilots in, as we talked about, but also we need our experienced pilots. So what are your thoughts on pilot training? And I think you already talked about it a little bit, but just if you want to expound upon that a little bit.
Yeah, so my thought is to protect the 1,500-hour rule. But if you are going to start to, and the deal that was made in this bill that Senator Thune and I came to was to acknowledge, for me on my part, to emphasize that the FAA has always had the authority to create new pathways for first officers. I don't deny that the FAA can create a new pathway to the first officer, for somebody to become an ATP first officer. But if they're going to substitute any of that hourly requirement with simulator, it must be full motion 6-degree simulator. It can't just be structured training, which is what the language in the amendment that Senator Thune had put forward, without actually defining what structured training is. And his agreement to the deal was to say that should the FAA create a new workforce, a new pathway, the airlines could actually apply for certification for sending people through that process. So basically, we leave the door open for additional pathways, but we don't degrade the 1,500-hour rule. And in fact, we set some pretty tough standards on what simulator training will qualify, because we all know a simulator isn't a simulator isn't a simulator.
Okay. So at the beginning of the year, we saw two terrifying aviation incidents. Japan Airlines plane that crashed into a Coast Guard aircraft at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, killing 5 people. Fortunately, everyone on board the Japan Airlines plane was able to safely evacuate before it was consumed by flames. And then there was the Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9, whose door plug fell off in mid-flight. And this came after more than a year of close calls and near misses at airports across the United States. So I want to ask you about the Japan-Alaska Airlines flight in a minute, but before I do, more broadly, do you believe that our nation is experiencing an aviation safety crisis? And if so, what do you think we need to do to address it?
Oh, we very much are in an aviation safety crisis. And I've used that language before. And in fact, the FAA did a whole safety review at the beginning of last year because of that. Now, what do we need to do? Several things. We need to tighten up and give the FAA greater authority and push the FAA to use their authority in terms of their oversight of aviation. Again, a lot to do with the manufacturers self-certifying aircraft like they did with the MAX 8, and we had problems with that. I've been pushing the FAA to really step up, and getting an FAA administrator in was absolutely critical, because you saw what happened when you finally have an FAA administrator. When we needed to look at what's happening with the MAX 9s, he stepped right in and grounded those aircraft immediately. And so having a strong, decisive FAA administrator, I think, was critically important. And then we need to take a look at upgrading the infrastructure of our airports. We need ground radar at all of our airports. We still have airports that don't have ground radar. That's a problem, and there's money in this FAA reauthorization bill for that. So I'm not just coming out and saying put it in, but there's no money. We actually put money in this bill, and again, it's bipartisan. Jerry Moran and I have worked very hard on this bill. And so it's a combination of better workforce. We need more air traffic controllers. That's part of the problem. We need better experienced pilot. That's part of the problem. We need more equipment. That's also part of the problem.